Victoria 3 National Markets, Dev Diary number 9. This is about national markets, which is an absolutely fantastic and interesting topic. So it's about national prices, it's about market prices, it's about the local prices, it's about supply and demand, and it's about the market access as a bottleneck, as a potential bottleneck. So let's dive into that fascinating Dev Diary right now. Markets are what drives the game's dynamic economy by determining a rational price based on supply and demand for all trade goods in every state throughout the world. There are some things that are not like in the real world because you cannot have stockpiles there. But on the other hand, it makes a lot of sense because the state won't have, for example, furniture stockpiles. That would be something that the private investors, the private actors can do. And so it's totally okay for Victoria 3 to don't have stockpiles anymore, but rather everything is translated into the language of cash and supply and demand instantly. So expanding your national market to encompass more territory means more raw resources for your furnaces and more customers for your manufacturing industries. As the industrial base grows, so does your demand for infrastructure to bring goods to the market. For example, you might reach a bottleneck for production and your market, your local market, won't have enough market access to the general market or later on maybe to the international markets to bring all of the goods there. So you can overproduce as much as you want. The price won't fall anymore to supply your industry with low-priced base resources because you don't have enough infrastructure for that. So you have to balance infrastructure in. And that's something extremely good and something extremely useful, especially in these times when you have seen why has Amazon won so much? Why is Amazon such a big company? They have solved the problem of bringing goods to customers. And that was always a very, very big problem. And that's what limits the market access. The market access will be in the next Dev Diary. Now we're going into the market. The market here. Here we have the French market. The French market is swimming in cheap luxury furniture, porcelain, fruit and meat. Luxury clothes and wine are well balanced, but as far as luxuries go, sugar in particular, has a sizable deficit, and securing a reliable source of that would likely result in improved supply of domestic distilled liquor as well. So there is a bottleneck here because there's not enough supply for sugar, and so the industry cannot provide enough liquor, as you can see here in the French market. You can see here you have a couple of flags in this market, which means other people, other countries in that case, other governments have access to the market. The market capital is Ile-de-France, which is Paris, like it's the capital of France. Then this is probably the luxury goods category that you can see here. There's a couple of things here. You can see that that's very nice furniture. There's some china probably. I don't know what this is. There's some nice fruit. There's some sugar, as you can see here probably. And that might be the liquor or wine at least, or that below here might be the liquor, because you can see there's a balance that fails. That might be, I don't know. One of that is cocoa or coffee, and the other thing is sugar. That might be the sugar problem we have here. So we have a sugar problem, and because of that we also have a liquor problem. There's a difference between sell orders and buy orders. So we have an overproduction of furniture. So you might want to export that if you have that there. But you have an underproduction, an underpresence of sugar in that, and that underproduction would lead to the liquor producers not having enough sugar, and so they cannot produce as much as the buy orders are there. What influence does this have? It's probably the way that probably the market price rises, but you cannot also go above a certain price. People just won't pay above a certain price. So that's coming later. That's the base price system. By default, every country is in control of its own market, which is typically but not always centered on their capital state. In that case, we have France, Ile-de-France. Every state connected to this market capital over land or by sea through ports is also part of the market. These states all have a variable degree of market access, representing how well connected they are to every other state in the market. Market access is based on infrastructure, and which will be in the next dev diary, together with market access, because that plays such a big role. All local consumption and production in states contribute to the market's buy orders and sell orders. So all local consumption and production also. Think of these as orders on a commodity market. Higher consumption of grain will cause traders to submit more grain buy orders, while higher production of silk will result in more sell orders for silk. So if there's something to sell, as I said, there's no stockpiles. If there's something to produce, that will go to the market. If there's something the producers or the people want, the buy orders will go to the market. There's the example of furniture. Furniture is a popular commodity with a growing urban lower middle class, and it's not likely its price in the French market will drop anytime soon. They don't have IKEA. Assuming the appropriate raw materials remain in good supply, which is wood, which is probably not a problem in France with its massive forests, upsizing this market's furniture industry is a safe bet. As you can see here, the market price is nearly at the top of its price that can be. Like there's limits to the price. So furniture can be sold from 15 to 45, and above and below there's nothing. So you cannot sell furniture for like 5. That will not be done, or the price also won't explode to something like 100. Now on the one hand I really like this system for commodities. On the other hand I think that maybe with grain there should be some more freedom, because grain has had a very, very high volatility. Like these fundamental goods usually go for very low prices, but if there's a crisis, like there's bad weather everywhere, then prices for things like grain, like for these fundamental goods, will explode. And that should be reflected in the market somehow, I think. We'll see if that will come. As we discussed in the goods development diary, all goods have a base price. And what I've talked about, I would call it a base corridor also. This is the price it would fetch given ideal market conditions. All demand is fulfilled perfectly with available supply, with zero goods produced in excess of demand. If buildings produce more than is being demanded, each unit produced will be sold at a depressed price. This benefits consumers at the detriment of producers. Conversely, if demand is higher than supply, the economy of buildings producing those goods will be booming, while POPs and buildings that rely on that goods to continue operating will be overpaying and will be suffering a bit. And that leads to investment, right? When determining prices for goods across the market's many states, we start by determining a market price. This is based on the balance between markets' buy and sell orders. So that's how the game processes it, with a base price as a baseline. The base price of this furniture would probably be 30. The more buy orders than sell orders, the higher the price will be, and vice versa. So you have more buy orders than sell orders, so the price goes up. Buy orders and sell orders submitted to the market are scaled by the amount of market access the state has. So there's a maximum amount of buy and sell orders you can have, as I understand it, in that market. And above that, nothing will be done. It will probably be done like proportionally. And so if you overproduce too much, it will just go and be a cost factor. It will not give you any more income. It will not help the people buy something from the market. It will just go to waste. This means a state with underdeveloped infrastructure will trade less with the market and rely more on locally available goods. States with full market access will use the market price for all its goods, otherwise only part of the market price can be used, with the remainder of the local price made up by the local consumption and production of the goods. All actual transactions are done in local prices, with market prices acting to moderate local imbalances proportional to market access. That's the big influence of market access. We have something like glass here, as you can see here. And there's something that you can see here as well. With furniture we had 50 to 45, and it seems like they have this principle that a price can at the maximum triple. So The corridor is always three steps, I would say. The ideal line for the market price of glass would be 40. The minimum would be 20, like half of that, and the maximum would be 60, like that, the 3 times of the maximum, or 50% more than the ideal price. So in that case, glass is overproduced, coupled with suffering market access in Orsha. This means the glass works there cannot sell at the somewhat high market norm for their goods. As you can see here, the price for market access is 73%. So you would get 45, which you can see here. That's the market price, 45 in the Russian market. But because you cannot do that, you only get the 39. So, but there's something additional to that from the market access. So the glassworks there can't sell at a somewhat high market norm for their goods. This works out fine for local pops in urban centers who consume it as they get to pay less than the market price, which we see here. Glass costs 39.8 in Orsha. But continuing to expand the glassworks in Orsha will only lead to worsening market access for all local industries. Because you flood the market with glass and you don't have enough infrastructure, this glass will block access for the other goods to the market. Like, for example, you have a barrel, or like you're preparing a suitcase, and your suitcase is the market access. And you can only put a limited amount of things in the suitcase. Other than that, it won't fit in. And the next suitcase will go out with more glass in it. But of course, when there's more glass in it, because glass is proportionally higher produced there, then fewer of other goods will be in there. And it will be to the detriment of everyone if you overproduce that way with such a low market access, such a low infrastructure. It won't lead to a better price of glass anywhere else, since fewer and fewer of Orsha's glass sell orders ends up reaching the market. We can see this development on the market price chart. The market price used to be high due to low supply. We have it here, nearly reaching over 50. Then they started expanding the glassworks in Orsha, which lowered the market price. Bump. It went below 40. Until the point Orsha's expanding industry became a bottleneck and prices started to rise again. Boom. So, the last few expansions have done nothing to lower the market price, even as the local price has been steadily dropping, as you can see here. If an oversupply becomes large enough, the selling price will be so low, producers will be unable to keep wages and thereby production volume up, unless they're receiving government subsidies. Oversupply is not remotely as bad as when goods are grossly undersupplied, which causes a shortage, which blocks everything. I mean, it goes through the whole supply chain. Like if you're missing one of the goods, for example, we had that at the start with the sugar. Yeah, you probably need some kind of fruit for the liquors, and then you need sugar. And if you don't have the sugar, then everything will go to waste. Goods being in shortage leads to terrible effects for those in your market who rely on it. For example, drastically decreased production efficiency of buildings that rely on it as an input. Shortages demand immediate action. Whether that be fast tracking, expanding your own domestic production, importing it from other markets, or expanding your market to include prominent producers of the goods. So you have to be very aware of that now, as you cannot have stockpiles anymore in that system. Everything is represented by cash. So if you cannot have a stockpile to prepare for something like a big grain crisis, you have to have a very high production of it or very reliable connections to get your grain in. Otherwise, you will be in a situation one day where grain is just at its, I don't know, 3 times the price, and you have to pay it, or everything breaks down. Everything that depends on grain will break down. Then probably your burgers will be unhappy because they don't get bread enough, and so on. These are the terrible effects of shortages, which you can at the moment see like in chip production with graphics cards. And not only graphics cards, it's swapping over to to cars, to just about everything. And what will that lead to? I mean, these prices exploding so much, it might probably lead to some local production springing up and like taking that, either politically or capitalistically motivated. And it would be a very good reaction to that, because these kinds of supply problems are what leads, or what led in the past, often to the breakdown of civilizations. Something like that has a lot of ripple effects that lead to something else breaking down. So expanding your market to include prominent producers of the goods. That's something, that's the normal thing. Eh? You look for other suppliers. Lacking access to a sufficient quantity of dyes, for example, here with this textile mill. This poor textile mill can only manufacture 42 units of clothes instead of 126. So it's roughly 1/3 of the production it can make, which is entirely insufficient to make ends meet, because they have much too few dyes. Unless something changes, its wages will be cut to compensate, and eventually cash reserves will run dry, rendering the building inoperable, as its workers will abandon it, because they don't want to work for nothing, right? So the first reaction of the capitalist is to lower the wages. Then they can try for the state to give them some subsidies, and if that doesn't work, then the workers are set free. There's no other option. The weekly balance here is terrible. It's minus 1.37k. If importing dyes, growing them on plantations, or manufacturing them in high-tech chemical plants to fix the shortage is not an option, returning the textile mills to pre-industrial and low-yield handicraft will remove the need for dyes and restore the textile mills to marginal profitability. As you can see here, with the dyes, it gets much more efficient, but you have to have the dyes, otherwise it's wholly inefficient. And so you go back to handicraft. You only need the 63 cloth probably input. The expenses go down by far because the dyes cost a lot. The revenue goes up because you don't have the bottleneck from the missing dyes. And so you produce 57 instead of 42. And that leads to a small positive weekly balance. Because you don't need the dyes, the wages, yeah, they are a little bit lower. But you probably also need less people, and that's one of the things that leads to that. Because you don't need to use the dyes. Throughput stays the same, revenue goes up because you can produce more, because you don't need the dyes, you don't have the bottleneck. Astute observers familiar with the previous Victorias will note there are no goods stockpiles involved in this system. In the predecessor game, a single unit of goods would be produced, sold, traded, perhaps refined, stored, and ultimately consumed. The global price development determined by how many units are inserted into or removed from the world's total supply. In Victoria 3, a single unit of goods is produced and immediately sold at a price determined by how many consumers are willing to buy it at the moment of production. So what this does is it basically makes the world market simulate stockpiles through cash prices. So the world market acts in a very modern way as the global stockpile. So you can simulate it like this. It has weaknesses in crisis simulations, in my opinion, but it's of course very good for the game to simulate it like that, because the state won't stockpile much. I mean, there could be an option that the state stockpiles something, but it was very, very rare usually. Maybe something like bread would be stockpiled, but only in crisis situations. Usually the state didn't stockpile much for its citizens, maybe like weapons for the army, but other than that, not so much. So this is a viable option. When this happens, prices shift right away along with actual supply and demand. So when everything is produced, the prices shift right away along with supply and demand. If there's a lot of supply, more supply than demand, then the prices go lower. And trade between markets is modeled using buy and sell orders. This more open economic model is both more responsive to sudden economic shifts and less prone to mysterious systemic failures, where all the world's cement might end up locked inside a warehouse in Missouri. Yeah, so that was the weakness of the old system, that you that you have a stockpile there, and the stockpile influences the market price, while in the real world, the stockpile doesn't influence the market price. The stockpile is just something separate from the market. Only if you know that there's a stockpile that exists, then it might influence the market price. But if no one sells that stockpile, then it won't influence the market price that much. If you've ever played a game called Patrician, then you know that stockpiles can lead to very, very weird effects, and that you can have stockpiles piling up somewhere in crazy amounts if you try to manage it automatically. So that system is a very sound system to simulate that. It can have some problems when simulating crisis, though. Any stockpiling in the system is represented as cash, for example, through a building's cash reserves or a county's treasury, or as pop wealth, which forms the basis for standard of living and determines their level of consumption. So, but we don't have to forget, this is a game, and you cannot really 100% simulate real world with a game, because real world is so chaotic that some things just cannot be simulated. As the econ nerds, you know who you are, will by now have intuited this lack of goods stockpiling in turn implies that in Victoria 3 they've moved away from the fixed global money supply introduced in Victoria 2. Main reason for this simply to how many limitations such a system places on what one can do with the economy in the game. Victoria 2's extremely restrictive and technically challenging closed market and world market buying order, it simply wouldn't have been possible to do things such as goods substitution, trade routes, dynamic national markets, transportation costs for goods, and so in the ways they have, either due to incompatibilities in the design or simply because it couldn't possibly be made performant. They believe that the complexity, responsive simulation and interesting gameplay added by this approach more than make up for what is lost. Yeah, so stockpiles have big problems. The other system also has its problems, but it's more to the spirit of the times, like just in time, and it's much more easily simulated. With stockpiles, you get into a system that is really crazy. It's like the real world. You cannot simulate the real world. You can only do it to some extent. And to that extent, this game will probably do a very good job. Finally, a small teaser of something. There will be talking more about the diplomatic gameplay. It's possible for several countries to participate in a single market. We have seen that above here in the French market, for example. That's something like a you could call it a trade treaty. Maybe there's something like a trade treaty. Coming back to that, sometimes this is a result of a customs union pact. It's like a trade treaty, led by the more powerful nation, but more often it's because of a subject relationship with a puppet or semi-independent colonies. Yeah, so the main thing, the main driver at that time was still colonies. In certain cases, countries can even own a small plot of land inside someone else's market, such as a treaty port. The route to expanding your country's economic power is not only through increasing domestic production and consumption, but also through diplomatic and or military means. For these things to get access to more markets. So, market access is something worth fighting for. Here we have something very interesting. The Zollverein, or German Customs Union, is a broad unified market of German states controlled by Prussia. Without such a union, many smaller German countries would find their economies too inefficient and trade opportunities severely hampered by geography and lack of access to naval trade. So through that big Prussian market, they could have access to the seas even if they were completely landlocked. And because of that, these market conglomerates or market treaties, market unions were made. Of course, it gives Prussia, in that case, who has a lot of army, who has protection for the sea routes, it gives them a lot of power, but also, like in exchange, there is a more steady supply of goods and a more steady opportunity to sell goods for the people in the smaller counties. But you can see there already, when you look at the shape of the Prussian market, that these markets precede the nations that will form. Germany, especially, that united very, very late in the game. I mean, and in reality is a prime example for that, because it had so many, such small and weird and complicated states, and the only way for them to survive and to get some kind of power was to work together. And so that led finally to the unification of Germany. Economy as the driving force in the Victorian age. So that was a very interesting dev diary of the fundamentals of Victoria III's pricing and domestic trade system. Next time, market access, infrastructure. These kinds of things. That will also be very cool and will complete that in a way. So I'm looking forward to that. Have a great time until next time, and happy gaming. This is Immanuel Can signing out. See you soon and happy gaming.